Sugar cane, sweet sugar cane, the sweetness of our southern trees. Sugar cane, sweet sugar cane.
Okay, the first thing I'd like to talk about is the normal problems we have after a freeze. The freeze normally lowers the pollen cane, lowers the juice purity and the syrup purities, increases gums and viscosity, slows sugar boiling, and you might have long and needle grain. And that usually results in reduced grinding rate, reduced sugar quality, reduced recovery of sucrose in the factory, reduced sugar yield, and sometimes if you have to process the cane when it's frozen, has a lot of problems going through the mills. But before I start, let me just look at some of the previous years. The blue bars are the cane tonnage since, well, for the last 10 or so years. The red lines are the sugar yield. And you can notice in a lot of cases that when the sugar yield is high, the tonnage is low, and vice versa. However, this last crop, we had relatively low tonnage and low sugar yield. One of the things that affect the crop and the sugar yield during the crop is rainfall. Now I'm going to look at comparing the 2019 crop with the 2017 crop, not the 18 crop, because we did have a freeze at the end of the 18 crop. But you can see rainfall varies over the crop, and that can cause some drops in sugar yield and recovery. But looking at some of the cane properties over the crop, this first slide shows fiber percent cane over the crop. The solid dark line is 2019, and the dashed line is 2017. And you can see the fiber may be varied half a point at the most over the crop. That's not really that significant. But in the slides I'm going to show you, one thing you may want to bear in mind is, although it's the 17 or 18 weeks of the crop, perhaps the first few weeks and the last few weeks of the crop not really comparable, because we have factories starting up at the beginning, factories ending at the end, and they have inefficiencies or errors in reporting during those periods of time. Grinding rate. If we look at the grinding rate, the solid line on top was the grinding rate in 2017. The dashed line below it, that was from 2017. And you can see we were higher grinding rates throughout the crop. So we didn't have any effect on grinding rate due to the freeze. You can see the freeze came pretty much in the middle of the crop. If we look at pole extraction, this is the percentage of sugar extracted in the juice from the cane. It varied very slightly for those 2 years, 2019 and 2017, and less than half a point difference in extraction, partly due to the fiber in the cane. If we look at the syrup purity, at the beginning of the crop, we were running, well, let me back up. The solid line at the bottom is the syrup purity for the 2019 crop. The green line on top was for the 2017 crop. And you can notice for the first 6 weeks or so of the crop, we were about 1 purity point less than in 2017. Then we had the freeze. After the freeze, the difference between the syrup purity in 2017 and last crop was about 3 points. So you can see we lost 2 points of purity following the freeze. We look at molasses production. The top line is the production last crop. The dashed red line was 2017. And you can see we did make a little bit more molasses throughout the crop, except right at the beginning and right at the end, which you can probably ignore those. If we look at the purity of the molasses, the solid line is the molasses purity. You'll notice the molasses purity was constant or maybe increased very slightly up to the middle of the crop when we had the freeze. After the freeze, the molasses purity dropped. In 2017, the green line above, you can see that increased basically slightly over the whole crop. It used to be that molasses purities would start low and increase throughout the crop. But the last two crops, we have noticed that after, well, at least in the last portion of the crop, sometimes we've been getting lower purities than normal for the end of crop. But the combination of amount of molasses and purity, actually the loss in molasses, loss of sugar in molasses in 2019 was basically the same as in 2017, right around 17 pounds sugar per ton of cane. Filter cake doesn't cause a big loss in sugar, but we did have, this is the production of filter cake for those 2017, 2019 crop. The dark line on top was last crop. We did make, you know, maybe 20, 30, 40 pounds more filter cake per ton of cane over the crop, but that had more to do with the rainfall and the distribution of the rainfall than it did have anything to do with the freeze. If we look at the pole in the filter cake, the amount of sugar in the filter cake, you'll notice it was very comparable up until the freeze in the middle of the crop. After the freeze, last crop, we had lower pole in filter cake, partially because the cane had lower pole. But once again, the difference in how much sugar we lost in molasses was less than half a pound per ton difference between 2017 and 2019. Okay, what makes the biggest difference is pole in cane. Pole in cane is essentially the sucrose in cane, and the more sucrose in cane you have, the more sugar you're going to make. The solid line at the bottom was the pole in cane last crop. And you can see it was increasing up until the middle of the crop. The slight drop before the middle of the crop, somewhere back here, that was due to rain. But in general, we were increasing. However, once the freeze hit, pole in cane declined fairly fast after that, faster than normal. This next slide shows the red line in the middle is the average pole in cane for 2019. The green line at the top and the blue line at the bottom are two individual factories, two of the factories most affected by the freeze. And you'll notice that the red line after the freeze declines, whereas those other two factories subject to the most cold-weathered cane, the green and the blue line, they drop off a lot faster than the average drop-off last crop. So that's showing that the yield was hurt a lot by the freeze. If we look at the sugar yield, this is the sugar yield for those last two crops, and you'll notice they follow similar trends, except that last crop's sugar yield fell off a lot faster. This next slide looks at the sugar yield for four different periods. The black line in the middle that looks a little jagged, that's last crop's sugar yield by week. The two top curves are multi-year averages. One is for the last 5 years, and one is for the last 10 years, and you really can't tell them apart too much. They're a normal trend where the sugar yield increases by about the 8th or 9th week, somewhere around mid-October, mid-November to the 3rd week in November. That's when we normally have our highest sugar yields. The red line at the bottom, that's for the last 20-year period. And you'll notice the 20-year average is a lot lower than either of the last 5 or 10 years. In other words, sugar yields have been improving over time. But the last crop numbers, the black line, you'll notice we started similar to the multi-year averages. Apart from the point where we had the rain that caused a little depression, and then the freeze, which caused the fall off after that. This was the 2000 TRS numbers and factory yield numbers over the crop. And you can see that they tracked fairly well. For the 2017 crop, this again is the factory yield and the core lab predictions, and you can see once again they're tracking very well. If we look at sugar yield and pole and cane, the sugar yield is the red line, and the blue line is the pole and cane. And you can notice that pole and cane is the main driver of the sugar yield. But as the pole and cane dropped off after the freeze, so did the sugar yield. If we look at the liquidation factor, okay, the liquidation factor is the amount of sugar the factory makes compared to the prediction. And for the 2017 crop in red and the 2019 crop in black, it fluctuated a little bit, but the average for both years was 110. So there was almost no difference between what's made and what was predicted for those two crops. This next slide looks at the boiling house recovery, or sometimes it's called retention. This is the percentage of sugar recovered as a percentage of the sugar in the juice. And they didn't vary a lot between 2017 on the top and 2019, the solid line on the bottom. Probably about 0.5 to 1% difference. And most of that difference is due to the fact that the purity was lower this year throughout the crop. But you'll notice following the freeze, the difference increased a little bit. This next slide looks at the overall recovery. Okay, the overall recovery is the percentage of sucrose recovered in the sugar compared to what's in the cane. And the numbers run about 85 to 88 or whatever. And the difference between 2017 and 2019 was on the average only about 1%. So the factories still did a very good job of recovering sugar. The next thing I'd like to look at is the effect of the freeze on the sugar quality. First quality is sugar pole. The solid line is 2019 crop. The dashed purple line is 2017. And you'll notice the pole and cane hardly varied between those 2 years. Very close. So basically, there was no effect. If we look at the starch content of the sugar, it was going down most of last year. When the freeze came, it continued to go down and was never a problem for the factories. So we didn't have any effect of the freeze on starch. If you look at the DEXTRAN, DEXTRAN started low, increased, and then it actually decreased before the freeze hit. Once the freeze hit, the DEXTRAN after that was low throughout the crop, and that was never an issue. Another quality parameter for the sugar is sugar color. You'll notice we started the crop low, it increased, it started to decrease, then we had the freeze, and after the freeze it didn't increase after that. So basically, we had no problems with sugar quality due to the freeze. Okay, in conclusion, the grinding rate was not affected by the freeze. The pole in the cane was low at the start of the crop, but after the freeze, it declined much faster than normal. The syrup purity was about 1 point lower than previous crops at the start, and after the freeze, it became about 3 points lower than normal. So we had a drop in purity following the freeze. Factory efficiency really didn't change. The overall recovery and the boiling house retention and the pole extraction hardly changed. Sugar quality was not affected by the freeze. But cane tonnage did decline a lot after the freeze due to perhaps better topping and tops falling off and dehydration. So the main issues from a factory standpoint were the big drop in the pole in cane, which reduced the sugar yield, a couple of points drop in syrup purity, which contributed to a slight reduction in the sugar yield, and the factories and the growers both lost a lot of cane following the freeze due to reduced cane tonnage. Thank you.
Sugar cane, sweet sugar cane, the sweetness of our southern trees. Sugar cane, sweet sugar cane, fireflies in the jasmine scented breeze. There's a little shade beneath this tree, shields me from relentless heat, an afternoon shower.